So kind of speaking to the whole funding and the budget, kind of leads me into, I guess, kind of trying to understand the leadership and how the full police force works. So like a lot of the community, we only have real exposure to the police officers that are responding to calls or on a beat, but not all the other.
Where are they getting orders from?
And where does it come down from? Because a lot of people have issue with police, but are they also more having issue with systemically how police are being trained and what they're being told to do and who's ultimately making some of those decisions? So I guess to understand a little bit more about the leadership in policing and where does everything kind of come down from?
Right. So I guess we're just going to try to explain it from the ground up standpoint. So you're going to have your first level line, your first line of workers, which is your police officers, and then you may have a second line would be corporals or sergeants, depending upon the department. They all have their own preference. And then you got your third line, which is lieutenants. Some parts, if they're small enough, they don't have lieutenants. They'll go straight to captains. And then you go to your majors, and then maybe your deputy chief, and then you get up to your chief. And then the chief is going to answer either to the council or the mayor, the manager, depending upon your locale and how it's structured. But basically, you're going to have a chief of police that's going to make most of the day-to-day decisions when it comes to policy, procedures, and how things are handled for the department. And that's usually how a lot of businesses are run. A lot of corporations, they do the same thing. They have the CEOs, and then they have their CFOs and CMOs and all those C-suits, and then they go down to the president, vice president. And, that's how that system, I forgot the name for it. It's a paramilitary style, and a lot of corporations have adapted the same thing. That's the leadership structure. The and these problems are not just exclusive to police departments.
Right.
But particularly for police departments, the problem is with that structure is that if you don't have a good chief, it can bode very bad for the department, for the morale and things of that nature. And I've unfortunately had the experience to be a part of a department that did not have a good chief. And when you don't, you end up sending some of your best talent, some of your better officers, some of your more experienced officers away because they feel like they don't have anybody on their side when it comes to dealing with not only just the public, but anything within the department. Right. So I'll just give a brief example. My former department, when I was working for MARTA, there was an issue where we didn't like people to have tattoos below a certain level in their arms, and we were allowed to wear baseball caps with the logo, the police logo on it. These are silly rules, but these are the type of things that chief wanted in place. And the reason why we know it was that, because when they got a new chief, they went away. It was a thing about beards, no beards. New chief comes in, everybody got a beard now. So it's one of those things where you look at it like, well, why is it that we had to wait so long for some of these changes? And some people might look at this like, well, it's not that big of a change. Well, it goes deeper than that. It goes much deeper than that on how things are set up, how people police. So I'll give you a scenario. So if you have a chief that likes to discipline their officers for every little thing, they like to, even for crime, like they will blame their officers for the crime that takes place on their beat, on their responsibility.
Right.
Now you can imagine that you be responsible for any machine that breaks down. There's over like 1 million machines or 1,000 machines. Right. There's over 10,000 machines that come in and out of that area or whatever. So obviously, it's not realistic to say that nothing can ever happen. But this is what would happen sometimes when crime occurred, and they would go back and say, okay, well, you didn't go out there and stand in your lot for X amount of time, or you didn't do this and you didn't do that. And this is more of like a specific situation for my department. But there were disciplinary action taken against you. Right. So now what that does is it makes you, and that's just speaking from that standpoint, it goes much deeper than that, from assaults. So when people get assaulted in your station and things of that nature, and then, so now it kind of makes you even more on hinge and more on edge when you're doing your job. So if you don't have a leadership structure in place that actually cares and sympathizes with their officer, you're going to have situations where the morale is going to be low, and you're going to lose a lot of your good talent because it's not always about the money. It's very important, but we also want to be somewhere where the stress level internally is low. See, the stress level is already at high. Just I can't even describe, especially for those more tense situations, how high the stress levels are.
Right.
But you don't need that on the other side. When I come into the doors of my police precinct, I don't need to feel cut the tension with a knife. And that's how it was sometimes.
Right.
You just did not know how situations would play out. And that was for my department. But there are other departments like that where you go in and you don't know what's going on. You don't know if your department's going to have your back or not. You don't, and that's not a good feeling to have as a police officer. And I know chiefs have to walk a very tight rope when it comes to the public, when it comes to certain things, like when it comes to disciplinary action, when it comes to supposed accusations of misconduct from a police officer to the public. That's a totally different thing. There is certain procedures and certain things that have to take place. You have to investigate those things because we don't want anybody out there mistreating the public. So obviously you understand that. It's just the other stuff that you can control, that you can try to be fair and try to be more understanding on, and you don't do that. That's when people look at you like, listen, I understood when it was more about the public, but this stuff is internal stuff. This is stuff that you can control. This is, you are in power. You're the ones making the decision. Why is it that you don't like this? Or why is it that it's about what you like instead of about what your department wants as a whole?
Right.
And that's why I think the leadership structure should change. I think.
Can I ask you one question in terms of like when you're talking about leadership and things? Do you think that there's a disconnect between like the police officers that are actually enacting the policing and then the people making decisions about how that is done? And at what point, when you're talking about this police structure and leadership, where do people basically stop becoming police and they're more management of that and making policies? And do you think that that's the issue, is that, you know, we have chief of police who probably haven't been out policing for 20 years maybe or something? Like how long could it be since they've actually answered a call and know what it's like on the street and how it is? And is that the problem, is that we don't have enough communication going up and down so that the police chief has an idea of how it should be done, but they haven't actually been policing for so long that they might be out of touch in some cases with how it actually might be done. And so I guess where in that leadership do people kind of stop stepping away and they're no longer actually responding to calls and being a police officer, and more they're actually in the kind of management of it? So where in your structure does that change, and do you think that that might be where communication needs to increase so they have better?
Right, and that's what I was kind of getting into. You gotta have, to me, every police department needs to change the way they make decisions when it comes to their policy and procedures. Obviously, there's governing bodies and organizations, you know, CALEA is one of them, where police agencies have to adhere to these standards. So they're not making all the decisions. Some of this stuff is decided by those governing bodies, and if you want to, you know, be in line with the rest of the nation and the rest of the police departments around the nation, you have to do certain things and abide by certain rules and regulations. But that doesn't mean that some of the other more trivial and some of the other decisions that get made can't take any input from your lower levels. And I think that's why I would change this. If it was me, I would change the entire structure. I think you should have more of a council type of leadership structure with a clear leader that that basically responds and is in charge of when we start talking about emergency management in crisis scenarios. You know, you have a barricaded subject or a situation with these protests is one, or whatever the situation is. You need someone in clear leadership position, because you don't want to have a lot of bickering when we're trying to make a decision.
You still need somebody making an executive
You got to issue commands. It is a paramilitary style, and it has to stay that way in some aspect. But when we start talking about some of the other stuff that gets decided, that's when it's slippery, because a lot of bad decisions get made about the direction and community policing and things of that nature that they're not on the ground, so they don't really know, because they're in their offices. day in having meetings, and I'm not blaming them.
Right.
It
has
there's
to
a lot
happen.
Right. Somebody's got to be in these meetings.
Right.
Somebody has to, do those things. But knowing that it should put more of an emphasis and more of a priority on them to interact with their lower level officers to get the heartbeat of how things are going
Right.
on their streets.
Right.
And I'm not saying that some chiefs don't ride around. Like I said, it's really different.
Right.
It depends on that one person. That's why I said it needs to be a change, because if you don't have a good chief, if you don't have someone that's really hands-on, then the whole department will suffer.
Right.
And I don't think we should leave it up to one person
Right.
to destroy or take the department in new heights. Because yeah, it's great when you got a great chief. I knew some great supervisors
Sure.
that, man, I wish they was in charge, because I knew some other ones that sucked.
Right.
Just they didn't care, or they had no pulse on what was going on, or they were inexperienced, or they had been around too long, so they thought things would go like 1960s.
The way it's always been.
Like, yeah, so it's one of those things where if you put all that power in one person's hand, hopefully you get a good leader. It's almost like
it's kind of rolling the dice, though. Sometimes you get a really great chief, and that's going to make a really good department, and then you're saying, if you get a bad chief, that could really affect the whole department all the way down.
Oh yeah, it's like putting marbles in a bag, and then you just pick like, oh, hope I get the white marble out of all these black marbles, and that's not something you want to go forward with when you start thinking. And that, like I said, it goes well beyond just policing. But as for policing, that's really bad.
Right.
And
you could see how that affects the department, and how it comes down to then when people are complaining about, well, we need to change the police.
Right.
Is it that we also really need to change maybe the leadership and some of the chiefs in some of those situations?
Oh,
Are
absolutely.
those more the problem than the? Because I know, like, at least from kind of my external side, I know that when it comes down to the police officers who are responding, you guys are responding as what you're being told to do and how you're supposed to respond. And I know there's some leeway in there, but ultimately you have to answer also to essentially your bosses at the same time as the community. And sometimes that pressure makes the situations maybe not go the way that they should go, because you're thinking in the back of your head, am I going to get in trouble from my boss on this? But at the same time, I also have to police the community. And so you basically are answering to two different groups of people always.
Right.
And a bad on one side might make it more difficult for you to do the job that you need to do. But I think sometimes maybe people forget that police officers ultimately, like, they have to respond to somebody else too when it comes to their job and how they are conducting their job and things like that too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree on that.